is a production of the California Governor's Office of Planning and Research. My name is William Walker. I'm joined by my wonderful team, who I will introduce shortly as we wait to populate the Zoom room. There are about 50 participants currently participating, and we will hopefully get those numbers up. This presentation is an open office hours, so it'll be open for questions. You can start entering your questions in the Q&A portion of our screen, below. At the very bottom of your screen, there'll be a Q&A icon with 2 chat bubbles, and you can use that Q&A function to ask your questions of our panelists from the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. You may also upvote questions that are of the most interest to you. We'll give it a few more minutes as you all continue to join us. And we thank you for joining us on this Wednesday morning. We'll be starting the webinar, our office hours presentation for Senate Bill 743 implementation, in about 2 minutes. So we thank you for joining us this morning, and thank you for your patience. And thank you.
Well, it looks like Will is having some technical issues. So we will wait another minute or so for people to join, and then we'll get started. What we'll do, my name is Chris Ganson, for those of you who haven't attended office hours previously. We will do a quick walkthrough. We walked through the website at the end, our OPR 743 website at the end of the last office hours. We've updated it since then, so I'm going to do a quick walkthrough, and then we will turn to answering your questions. It looks like we already had a couple typed in. Great, we've got Will back.
I'm so sorry.
Glad to have you back, Will. It's the times. I've announced. I've announced at the beginning of many of these office hours that my understanding is these webinar-based platforms have about an 80 to 90% success rate. So I would say we've been lucky to have not had a major snafu on any of them, although we've had some behind the scenes sweating it a little bit, but we've been very happy to be able to bring this to you. So Will, do you want to jump in where we left off, and we can just get going then?
Yeah, I can continue. I'm not quite sure where we lost me, but I will again welcome us to the 6th installment of our open office hour, of our office hours series. This is an open office hours that will be answering questions to folks who are looking to implement Senate Bill 743 and new transportation impact analysis metrics that will begin to be implemented, if not already, July 1st. I'll take a moment right now to acknowledge the grief and stress that many of us are experiencing right now following the recent violent deaths of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Monica Diamond, Tony McDade, and other Black Americans. These deaths and the unrest that have followed come as Californians continue to grapple with the devastating deaths and health impacts caused by COVID-19, as well as economic impacts associated with the pandemic. Impacts which, like violent death, Black Americans and Black Californians experience at far higher rates than other groups due to longstanding structural and institutional racism, which we must continue to expand our efforts to address and eradicate. I want to acknowledge the disproportionate pain and burden Black Californians bear and urge all of us to work together every day for an equitable and just society. I also just want to acknowledge it's a challenging time. We're in the middle of what we know as LGBT Pride Month. We've just come off of a Father's Day weekend, and we're obviously socially distant, so folks aren't able to celebrate in the ways that folks normally should or want or could. So I just want to acknowledge that, and knowing that we have a lot of work ahead of us with this implementation, knowing that we also understand the times that we are facing as a state, the state of California. So, but to thank everyone for that aside there, and for joining us this morning. And I will hand it, before I hand it to Chris, I will introduce our wonderful team here. Chief Counsel Jeannie Lee. I'm not sure if I'm even sharing my screen anymore, but my screen is malfunctioning as I read our names. Jeannie Lee, Chief Counsel, Natalie Cuffle, Land Use Counsel, Alyssa Montanez, Special Assistant, myself, William Walker, Associate Planner, and our host for this morning, Chris Ganson, who is our Senior Transportation Advisor for the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. So again, pardon the technical difficulties, and thank you very much, Chris.
William, thanks for those introductions, and thanks for those words especially. Hope everyone out there is doing as well as can be in these challenging circumstances. We will dive in. Again, I'm going to do a quick tour of SB 743's updated website, updated even since I showed it at the end of office hours last week. Won't take too long for that though, so we can dive into your questions. Please feel free to use the question and answer box at the bottom. You can type in questions there. Feel free to type in short questions or long questions. And also, if you see questions which you would benefit from hearing the answer of, upvote those questions so we make sure to answer them first. We've been fortunate to make it through all of the questions in our 2-hour sessions so far in each session. And so hopefully we will today too. So I'm hoping to get to all of your questions. We have a little bit of a smaller crew today than we have in past. So please feel free and encouraged to dive in and ask a question. Okay, I'm going to share my screen so that I can show you our website. Okay, so I think you can see my screen, and one of my teammates will let me know if I'm wrong about that. This is the, great, thanks William. This is the OPR website, opr.ca.gov, and you get to the 743 website by hovering over Sequa and going down to Transportation, SB 743. Don't click on Sequa, that'll bring you to a different webpage. It's a little bit tricky. Hover over it and go down to 743. Okay, so just some introductory text. The main new thing that I want to show off is a frequently asked questions that we've just recently developed. So this contains a number of questions on kind of the background and purpose of 743. So these might be helpful for those who are newer to 743 or for you to point people to who are newer to 743. And then some questions on implementation. Now, of course, these don't answer all the questions about the contents of the technical advisory and such, because the technical advisory is just below it here. The technical advisory is our detailed recommendations on how to implement SB 743, and they contain quite a number of details, about 30 pages, a couple appendices at the back. If you are trying to sort out the technical details and to some extent the legal details on how to implement 743. This is your central resource, the technical advisory on evaluating transportation impacts in Sequa. Sometimes we simply call it the VMT-TA. Navigating back, and many of you have expressed interest in the and have asked about the Sequa guidelines language that implement SB 743. So OPR developed and the Resources Agency certified updates to the Sequa guidelines in order to implement 743. This button here will click you directly into that text, and it'll jump you to the page 11 here, where that begins right here, the new 15064.3, determining the significance of transportation impacts. And that's across these couple of pages right here. Actually goes on to page 13 and the beginning of 14. And a little further on. So that's where the Sequa guidelines changes are that implement SB 743. Mentioned a number of times our recommendations on significance thresholds, and that we suggest ensuring your significance thresholds are in line with state climate goals. And the California Resources Board has shared a document here for the last year or so. They've had this document out that crosswalks the state climate goals to project level thresholds, and that includes the 15% reduction beyond existing, referencing the regional or city average or regional average for housing and office. So the substantial evidence behind those thresholds, much of that's contained in this document. We have an induced travel calculator developed by the National Center for Sustainable Transportation. You just click in here and view tool. And it's a very simple to use calculator. You can put in the facility type, the location, let's pretend it's a class 2 or 3 facility in Alameda, the number of miles you're adding, say it's 4 lane miles, and very quickly get an answer that references, that draws upon the substantial body of induced travel literature, academic literature. So that's there. And last but not least, Caltrans has its own SB 743 website. Oop, the link is not yet working on that, I think. We'll have to check with our webmaster on that. Okay, anyways, you can Google Caltrans 743 website in the meantime. A few more resources. We have some narrated presentations. They're on our YouTube channel, and there are a couple high-level ones. Why this one, problems with LOS, is why 743 was important in the first place, benefits of using vehicle miles traveled. These are pretty high level. And then the next two are more in detail of how measurement is done. Recommendations for methods for land use projects, and recommendation and full counting, how to count vehicle miles traveled fully in your assessments. So those videos are available here. They're 5 to 8 minutes long or so. So they're pretty quick views. Good places to get started, and then you can dig into further details in the technical advisory. We did a 3-hour webinar. Many of you may have been a part of. That's recorded here on our YouTube channel as well. It's going to start playing if I let it go, so I'm going to go back because you don't want to hear one of my voices is probably at least enough. Probably 2 more than you'd like. Similar, we have recorded office hours here. Each of these office hours, including this one, are posted on in this place. You can go back and look at the other 5 office hours that we've held. There is a video here. I won't bother to click into it right now, but it's a very good and well-produced video on the issues we have with using automobile level of service standards, how it undermines an array of state goals, how it undermines even our goals in transportation and getting people to places, ironically, and raises some of those concerns in a very intelligible, digestible way. This part hasn't changed. We've added a bit of new resources, but mostly it's the same resources are available here. We have a set of resources in each of these on, so this first one is the problems with LOS and auto delay using as metrics, both for transportation, health, and environment. The benefits of using VMT, so a whole set of resources in here. And then onward through strategies for VMT reduction, induced VMT from highway capacity, including some of the studies and summaries of studies, quantifying that effect, some resources on automated vehicles and VMT, tools to measure VMT and also to measure access to destinations, just a partial, some of the many tools available, some resources on housing affordability and VMT reduction in rural areas, roadway pricing, which can be an important VMT reduction approach, and traffic safety. So we also have archives down here, earlier versions of the technical advisory, earlier frequently asked questions. Some of those might still be relevant, although many of them are from yesteryear, and then some earlier workshop recordings and materials if you want to dig into those. But you'd have to be pretty committed to want to go back and be a 743 historian at this point, with the number of fresh resources we have. Just wanted to give you the tour of the website. And with that, we'll start taking your questions. So let me.
Before you go to the first question, let's just remind folks that they can go to the bottom of the screen to answer your questions and to also upvote questions. Our first question is regarding implementation with MTA in Los Angeles. And luckily, I'm an LA Metro alumni, so I was able to find a report really quickly. The question from our audience is, does MTA have guidelines for SB 743? And what I was able to find on the MTA website is their report on Senate Bill 743 implementation, and that link is in the chat, so you can go ahead and click on that link. And if you were to go to page 6 of that report, I believe is where it starts explaining how Metro will address concerns regarding Senate Bill 743. I think I'm sharing my screen.
You are.
I think that this is page 6. So this is where Metro begins to talk about the implications of Senate Bill 743. That's page 6 of this report on their board archive or project studies archive website. So hopefully that's helpful to you. The front page of the report looks like that. I don't know if you have anything to add, Chris.
No, thanks, William. That was terrific.
All right. Let's go to our next question. I finally answered a question on our webinar series. I feel like I've achieved great goals today.
In your first, what is it, 6 weeks here?
Yeah. So I hope that's helpful for the person who's watching, and you can always ask again. There's only 2 questions posted, and we have a lot of time, or maybe we end early today, but I'll go to our next question. Again, you can go to the Q&A at the bottom of the screen if you'd like to participate in that way. The cemetery would have a few regular employees and occasional larger burial events. Should the analysis calculate VMT average daily trip miles or peak daily trip miles, what mitigation would be available for burial events?
Yeah, great. So let's take the first part of that question first. Looking at a cemetery, and the cemetery, Paul, thanks for your email yesterday too, would have a kind of obviously periodic VMT. One VMT might be very different one day from the next, kind of unlike your typical office project or large residential development. So the thing to keep in mind here is that VMT is essentially an umbrella metric for the array of impacts to human health and the environment that vehicle travel causes. So when you're looking at that, when you're looking at that, you want to kind of take these. You want to look at VMT on the aggregate, right? You don't want to look at it. You certainly don't want to look at it on a slow day, because you'll miss the the bulk of the impact. You also don't want to just look at it on a peak day, but maybe pick a time to average over, which sort of captures the average, or the regular, the overall impact. So in that case, it could be annual. You could use annual. If you were to look at annual VMT, you'd want to compare that to a significance threshold that was annual VMT. You need apples to apples comparison. You obviously wouldn't want to compare, do your analysis on daily VMT and compare to an annual VMT threshold. Right? Those need to be in the same units and the same currency, and comparable approaches. So let's see. There was another piece to this question, and now I'm not seeing it.
It was, I'm not either. Oh, what mitigation would be available for burial events?
Right, okay. So let's see, I'm trying to, I've yet to see a new cemetery project, so I'm trying to think of this as I'm off the cuff here. But so one approach, I'm just thinking off the cuff, would be to provide some sort of, if there were a funeral home and people are attending this funeral home and then moving on to the burial ground, and those were, as some are in some cases, a distance away from one another, providing some kind of a shuttle or bus that would allow people not to all get in their individual cars, as we often do, and travel, have the benefit of allowing people to be together a little more during the ceremony as well. Let's see. I'm not sure what other mitigation I can think of off the top of my head, but it's worth some thought. I will give it some more thought, and feel free to follow up if you have follow-up questions on that, Paul.
Yeah, and we're always available at sb743questions@opr.ca.gov. So anything we're not able to fully address here, that email address is also available on our website that we just took you through a nice tour of at opr.ca.gov. There are questions queuing up. I'll remind folks that you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask questions. This is a great opportunity. You have experts at your fingertips right now, at least for the next hour or so. And if the questions come in, we'll stay here till noon. How do you address the following scenario? An environmental impact report certified in 2019, which used LOS for traffic impact analysis. Further discretionary approval required in 2021 to address proposed change in project. Do you use LOS or VMT for subsequent analysis, whether that analysis is contained in an addendum or supplemental impact report?
And this is Jeannie or Natalie would be able to answer this question much better than I would. If they aren't available, let's go on.
I can hop in, Chris.
Great. Thanks, Natalie.
Yes, so for this question, Chris showed you that new helpful frequently asked questions document on our website. This specific question is answered there in more detail, but I will provide a quick summary, but I encourage you to check that out as well. So essentially you would be looking at Public Resources Code section 21166 and the factors there. Just like any other situation where you are doing further discretionary approval and there was a previously certified environmental document. For the case of SB 743, you'll likely be homing in on the section that asks whether there is new information about the project that wasn't known back in 2019. And we obviously don't have case law on the VMT an issue yet, since people are just now implementing that, but there is some case law about climate change. And when climate change was added to Sequa back in 2010, I believe, and we have linked those cases in our frequently asked questions document, so you can review those and see how the court addressed that situation, and then maybe get a sense of how the court would address VMT if they were considering that. But ultimately, it's up to the lead agency. They have discretion in this situation, and we'll be looking at section 21166 for that analysis.
All right.
And this is Jeannie. I don't have anything to add to that, so thank you, Natalie. But I do want to quickly point out, I might be going out of order, but going back to the cemetery question, I just noticed that Kathleen Dove had suggested that planners treat the VMT analysis similar to parks. So that's a thought too.
All right. Thank you, Chief Counsel Jeannie Lee and Land Use Counsel Natalie Kuffel. All right, our next question that's been upvoted, you can continue to upvote by using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Can you review the responsibilities of local governments to implement Senate Bill 743 or VMT analysis for land use projects?
Okay, yeah, this is a very broad question, so I'm going to touch upon it. And Dale, I would ask you to follow up if I don't go where you were hoping I would go. And Natalie and Jeannie, feel free to chime in if there's something I don't cover that you think would be worth mentioning. So local governments, essentially, as of July 1, are required to turn to use VMT as their metric of transportation impact. Let's see, review the responsibilities of local governments to implement SB 743 or VMT analysis for land use projects. So essentially, you could, as a local jurisdiction, adopt a resolution or another document with your approach that you're going to use for SB 743. You could also just let July 1 come, and the first project that you are performing, you're running Sequa on, do use VMT for your transportation analysis. You could simply turn to our technical advisory and pull thresholds from that. We have a large amount of substantial evidence, some which I've mentioned today, that you could stand on in using our guidance. You can do that on a case-by-case basis. So there is no absolute need to develop an approach ahead of July 1, but you can. So I hope that answers the question. Feel free to ask a follow-up question with additional detail.
All right. So our next question is, when you say the lead agency has discretion, are they required to consider VMT, or may they decide to use VMT?
So for, and Jeannie or Natalie, jump in if I'm using the incorrect language and there's a better, there's better terminology. So the lead agency has discretion on its approach to use VMT, but generally speaking, the lead agency is going to be required to use VMT for transportation impact analysis starting July 1. There is an exception there that for local streets and roads, capacity projects on local streets and roads, it's the lead agency's discretion of whether to use VMT, but for all land use projects and other transportation projects, the requirement is to use VMT.
All right. No rebuttal from our counsel, so we will continue.
Good.
I think I got the thumbs up from Natalie.
Okay.
We're listening. We're just not chiming in if Chris gets it right.
All right. Any thoughts on how to analyze a recreational vehicle campground, which is partially replacing a golf course? That's
Okay.
a very interesting question.
Yeah, there's two elements to it. So it's the question on the RV campground, and then the question of it's essentially a redevelopment. You're replacing something that was there before. So there's an interesting question of baseline. So taking the first part, how to look at an RV campground. So we have we provide recommendations on basically two core approaches. There's the approach we recommend on housing and office, and then the approach we recommend on retail and transportation projects. And we generally recommend starting with one of those. So I'll run through those very briefly. For housing and office, we recommend, because those are land uses that essentially new population is coming to work and live. So you need to look at the additional automobile travel that'll be generated. And then the idea is to look and see whether that's going to be more than 15% more efficient than what we have now, to be in line with state climate goals per our threshold recommendations. The recommendation we have for retail and transportation projects is to look at the area over which travel is affected and see what the change in travel might be. Now, an RV campground, from one perspective, you could imagine that people are going to be driving a long way from the next state or two states over to your RV campground, and that might seem like a lot of VMT. So it might make sense, but whether your campground really attracted that VMT, whether those people wouldn't be driving through wherever the campground is without the campground, is at least debatable. It's at least an interesting question, so that might be worth thinking about. But one approach would be to think through where RVs would be camping without your campground, and then how much extra VMT or reduction in VMT does your campground provide? Is it more on less out of the way or more out of the way than existing opportunities? If it's expected to draw more travel because the RV camp space is constrained, you might need to consider that. So a few different approaches. Even if you were going to go with a full trip generation, to be comparing to other similar land uses, other RV campgrounds, for example, to put it a little more, and put a finer point on it, substitutable uses, right? What would people be doing otherwise if they weren't going to this RV campground? And that's essentially the question you're trying to answer. And what is the VMT effect of that difference? So yeah, again, looking at one way to do it is use the retail approach and look at the total change in vehicle travel. For an RV campground, it might be bigger, it might be small. If it were small, it might a qualitative analysis might be appropriate. If it were large, it might be large. If it's replacing a whole golf course, then maybe a quantitative analysis is appropriate. So now let's take the part where it's replacing something. So so there were people traveling to the golf course before, and now those people won't be traveling to golf course. They'll be traveling perhaps to some other golf course, or perhaps doing something else. And to the best of your ability, Sequa doesn't require perfection, it requires the best available information. So with the best available information, what overall effect on vehicle travel is that going to have? That's one way to do it. Looking at the existing baseline, the travel with the golf course there, and then looking at the additional or reduced travel from RVs that the RV campground is creating, and then looking at the summing those or netting them overall. So that's off the cuff analysis, off the cuff answer to thoughts on analyzing an RV campground. I'll stop there for now, but feel free to follow up again.
Great. Our next question, just for folks who are interested in upvoting, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to upvote the 7 standing questions that are currently listed. and/or ask your new questions. Are there examples of cities or counties that have taken definitive actions to eliminate the need for LOS analyses in their environmental impact reports? The questioner is aware of county planning departments and county public works departments who still insist on LOS type analyses and that are slow to adopt Senate Bill 743.
Right. So for those, I guess we will see what approach they take. We don't know if they haven't taken it yet, but there are a number of cities that have made the shift to study VMT. Actually, there's more every day. I understand that a few more have gone since even the last, have made the shift since the update since even the last office hours. The cities that I'm familiar with, which are, in the single digits in number, but represent a substantial fraction of the state's population, about getting up to about a fifth or so of the state's population is in cities that are using VMT at this point. Those cities are generally keeping a very limited LOS or LOS type analysis in their transportation analysis approach, and outside of Sequa. So LOS is, of course, it can't be in a Sequa document after July 1. It can't trigger a significant impact. The way that most jurisdictions that I'm familiar with are keeping LOS is, so a fairly major development, say a city block in size, previously would have done an LOS analysis and would have had to cover probably about 100 intersections in the vicinity to make sure that they were safe from a petitioner coming and saying, but you should have studied this additional intersection. And of course, that's a quite substantial expense, might be $100,000 in analysis. With VMT, the analysis, of course, a lot easier and less expensive. The estimates we continually hear about 1/5 or 20% of the cost of an LOS analysis for VMT analysis. But they are asking for an operations analysis of some kind, or an LOS analysis at the, say, 4 intersections at the corners, or maybe one beyond that. So 4 to 10 or so intersections compared to the 100 that were being analyzed before. So, and then cities are using that information in a different way. So instead of, we have an LOS impact, we're having a knee-jerk reaction to that, and we need to fix the LOS impact and do something to get more cars through. They're taking that information in the context of all of the other interests the city may have. So they may find that there's an LOS impact, but solving that LOS impact, or improving LOS, would require worsening of pedestrian crossing distances, or a less safe intersection for bicycles or pedestrians. And so making the decision, using the city's values, applying the city's values to on how to approach what they're going to do with that intersection. Generally, these sorts of analyses inform the project, and the city might ask, hey, if you put your driveway right here in the front, that is going to really snarl the intersection at your corner. But if you rearrange slightly and put the driveway on the side street, that won't happen. So that's the sort of that sort of geometric solution, we call it in transportation, is the sort of solution that we're looking for, that cities appear to be looking for, rather than generally laying down more pavement or focusing, as Sequa required in the past, solely on automobile throughput through intersections.
The same questioner responds that the general plan policies for LOS are often a reason that EIRs still need to include LOS. They ask if there's a rebuttal for this, such as the policy does not affect an environmental impact. I also think that this question may be alluding to the fact that some general plan policies have not been updated since Senate Bill 743 was approved in 2013.
Yeah, that's certainly an issue as well. So general plans can still legally include LOS requirements. Two things. One, we recommend they don't on the project level. The general plan recommendations are pretty clear that we suggest that you not have a general plan require projects to hit LOS thresholds or maintain LOS thresholds. Also, LOS is no longer an environmental impact in Sequa. So if it is called out in a plan, Sequa only deals with, Sequa does deal with plan inconsistencies, but only so far as they cause environmental impacts. And because LOS is no longer an environmental impact, that's no longer an environmental impact. So that is not a Sequa issue. However, cities using their police power can require LOS. Once again, we recommend they don't. And we are looking into providing some additional advisory language on some of the problems with doing so. We talked a little bit this. I won't go into it now just because we talked about it in some depth in the last office hours, right at the beginning of the office hours. So I would suggest pulling up the recording of the last office hours and having listened through that discussion.
Which cities are good examples of implementing VMT to look at when drafting a plan?
Yeah, thanks. Off the cuff, I think that San Jose has a pretty interesting and successful implementation. Oakland and Los Angeles are three cities to look at. I know that, I'm not sure whether Oakland does. I know that San Jose and Los Angeles both have developed VMT calculators, and that their work developing VMT calculators has, if I can use the metaphor, paved the way for other cities to do the same. So if you, your city were to want to develop a VMT calculator, you could really stand on the shoulders of those cities and do it for a lot lower time and cost. Do note that Los Angeles, I'm not sure about Oakland, but Los Angeles and San Jose have applied more environmentally protective thresholds of significance for VMT, which is a lead you can follow or a lead you can not follow. They're more environmentally protective than our recommendations. I'd have to recall in LA's case. I don't have it on my fingertips, but San Jose, I believe, even though they have a lower VMT per capita than the region in their city, they use as their reference geography the thing you have to be 15% better than. They use their city average. So again, that's a little bit more environmentally protective than we recommend. But we are explicit that if a lead agency wants to apply a more environmentally protective threshold, they may. And despite that, they still have a good swath of their city covered in streamlined zone for housing.
Great.
Thanks.
Our next question, I will encourage the 64 of you that are with us to ask a question using the Q&A function below on your screen. Our city has a specific plan within an EIR, the questioner states, that was certified in 2013 based on LOS analysis and projects within the plan area, using this EIR to expedite the Sequa review process. After July 1, 2020, I'm assuming, we will need to conduct a VMT analysis for each project within the specific plan area. Is that's what the questioner is asking? And if so, is this a supplemental EIR?
I'm going to look at Natalie if she is available to answer that question. And if not, maybe Jeannie would be. They're going to be a lot better equipped to answer that question.
But Jeannie's ready to answer.
Yeah.
And Natalie.
I mean, either.
Support Harmony.
Well, I'll just go ahead. So thank you, Michael, for your question. I think it relates to the previous question about that Natalie had answered. And so if you're looking for more guidance on PRC 21166 and the corresponding Sequa guidelines, definitely please look at our FAQs on the new website or on the revised website. I think this will come down to, again, what Natalie covered, which is how do we and how do the courts view this new metric, this VMT metric. So whatever the agency's determination is, it must be supported by substantial evidence. So if the agency determines that VMT does not trigger any of the 21166 conditions, then the agency might just be able to use a notice of determination and also just expressly find that none of those provisions have been triggered. Otherwise, if the agency does determine that there have been substantial changes to the project or new information based on this VMT metric, then you may be doing either a supplemental, subsequent, or addendum. It totally depends on the substantial evidence and the project itself.
All right. It looks like that is a wrap for that question. I will go on to our next question. Several jurisdictions have resolved to request a delay in implementation of Senate Bill 743. Beginning July 1st, will they be required to use state guidelines? What happens if jurisdictions decide not to use these guidelines, but continue using LOS analysis for Sequa?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So the Sequa guidelines are regulatory, and so they unlike the general plan guidelines, they're binding, and they do say that beginning July 1st, LOS is no longer a metric of impact under Sequa, and that VMT should be generally the metric used for assessing transportation impacts. So what happens if a jurisdiction decides not to use VMT and continues to use LOS? Is simply that the document, their environmental document, when they do so, will be inadequate. So that document would be vulnerable to any sort of challenge. It would be a very simple and easy matter to challenge it.
Our next question. So for clarity, transportation agencies can still use daily vehicle hours of delay as a metric to justify a project, but any VMT increase because of the project then needs to be mitigated as part of the Sequa process. Is that correct?
Let me look at the question again, but I think yes, technically it is correct. Project that needs to be as part of the, yeah. So let me put a finer point on any VMT increase because of the project needs to be mitigated as part of the Sequa process. So Sequa, just taking a big step back, Sequa requires acknowledging significant environmental impacts and mitigating them to the extent feasible. So, so if the significance, depending on how the significance threshold is determined, and we do recommend that, again, connecting with state climate goals, and we do recognize that in there is a certain amount of VMT that the scope, the California Air Resources Board scoping plan shows that we can increase by in the coming years and still hit our climate targets, but that we're likely to consume that additional VMT just with population growth. So that means that there's quite possibly little or none left to allocate, if you will, towards roadway capacity projects. That said, a roadway capacity project could proceed even if it does have a significant impact on vehicle travel, vehicle miles traveled, with a statement of overriding considerations. There's also a number of mitigation approaches. We've talked a little bit about mitigation banking at other times, and that's something that's being pursued in various and multiple at the state and at more regional and local levels. So back to the question of transportation agencies can still use daily vehicle hours of delay as a metric to justify a project. So Sequa doesn't address, essentially, 743 doesn't, but Sequa doesn't in Sequa at all. It doesn't address the metrics you can use for planning. So vehicle hours of delay could be used as a metric to justify a project. A caveat here is that we are getting a better and better idea. We're not that we haven't had the science available for a long time, but we're really starting to lift it up and look at what the effect is of projects, in particular roadway capacity projects, on vehicle delay. And it turns out it's ultimately oftentimes not much, because induced travel refills the additional capacity. So yes, technically, transportation agencies can still use daily vehicle hours of delay as a metric to justify a project. But if that's a roadway capacity project, they might consider whether they're really going to be solving that problem with that project. Thanks.
Great. All right, our next question. Any suggestions for a church and school scenario, considering with COVID-19 pandemic and there is little to no traffic for the school and currently little to no traffic for the church? School already exists and church is new.
Okay, thanks. I'll give that one a crack. I guess you're adding a school already exists and church is new. I'm going to take this as adding a school to a church, but it may not matter too much exactly what the configuration is. One piece of the answer. So there's little or no traffic for a lot of things in the middle of this pandemic, although it's a lot of traffic is coming back as our economic activity picks back up. But we've certainly seen periods with little or no traffic. We wouldn't suggest using traffic measurements or VMT measurements during COVID times, because those are going to be unusual and certainly not the most that a project will generate or attract, or the most VMT a project will be associated or cause. So we would recommend looking at data at this point from, if you're looking for some sort of baseline from before the pandemic arrived. And then let me talk a little bit about approach for a school or a church. I could see kind of either of the two major approaches perhaps working, either looking at the trips attracted and comparing them to similar uses across the area, perhaps the region, generally the travel shed, the area over which people are traveling to those sorts of uses. Like we recommend for housing or for office. You could also use the other kind of major approach, looking at VMT without the project, and then looking at VMT again with the project and seeing whether how it changes. So if you're adding a church and people drove further to a church that was further away previously, and now they're able to go to this closer church, then VMT would go down, and that would indicate a less than significant impact. If the church was drawing people further afield and adding VMT, then that might indicate an impact. And you could use that same approach for a school as well. So I'll stop there, but again, please follow up if there's an aspect to the question I didn't get at.
All right, we have 2 questions left. So this is a point where I'd like to encourage folks to ask questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. I also feel like I need to say this, and I don't want to alarm anyone, but evidently there's been an earthquake during this webinar. It's centered around Lone Pine, which is in Inyo County. So hopefully people are safe. This webinar is being recorded, so if you're feeling you need to step away from it, please do. But I just want to acknowledge that I guess that's going on, and hopefully people are not harmed. The next question is, we will be taking an interim VMT process to council for approval. and then have the ultimate process approved with the general plan amendment. So we eliminate LOS as an environmental impact. We, the person asking the question, are looking at creating a safety analysis guideline using LOS for large projects. Will there be an issue with creating a separate requirement outside of the Sequa?
So let me step back and take the big question asked of what we can do outside of Sequa. I mean, the city has so-called police power, delegated power from the federal government technically, but to make laws that protect its citizens, keep them healthy and safe. And so, yes, there can be safety requirements outside of Sequa. And we generally recommend that most safety requirements be held outside of Sequa for a variety of reasons that I won't dive into right now. We also have some fairly detailed recommendations on approach on safety, and you can find those in the Appendix B of the general plan guidelines. It's a little bit of a strange place. Actually, I can show you it. Let me do a screen share really quick. Hang on just a moment. So sharing my screen. I'm going to go back to the OPR webpage, front page, opr.ca.gov. And oops, I click into something.
No, you're there. Oh, well, now I know.
I overshot. Okay, so here we go. Planning and land use, and then hover over planning and land use and general plan guidelines is where you want to go. So within the general plan guidelines, you simply click view the general plan guidelines, and then Appendix B, where is it? Here we go. Appendix B, SB 743, Safety Technical Advisory. So here's our recommendations on addressing safety. And we actually we don't think that LOS is a reasonable proxy for safety. We think that a fairly different approach is called for in order to actually create safety. So you've seen in webinars, and I forget whether I brought it up in office hours, that we've tended to focus our approach in transportation, we, the United States, on keeping cars moving at high speeds, at straightening curves and such, and providing accommodation for driver error, maybe a little extra shoulder space, or of course, guardrails and such. And there is a good amount of recent research over the last decade and a half, 2 decades on safety that point into different, in some cases, fairly opposite solutions. The 3 major points the safety literature makes are reduce driver speed and increase driver attention. And there's a number of ways to do that. Oftentimes, instead of, on surface streets particularly, instead of clearing space near the road so drivers could go faster and have more space to make errors, it turns out that contributes to driver inattention, which is really bad news for crashes. Of course, higher speed crashes are more injurious and fatal, and higher speeds, all else equal, lead to more crashes as well. So creating situations that drivers need to focus and keep their attention actually helps safety a good amount. A focus on protection of vulnerable road users is important. We've seen as motorist safety fatality rates have improved, we've seen bicycle and pedestrian fatality rates really skyrocket, and that needs to be addressed per mile traveled. These vulnerable road users have a lot more injury and fatalities. But fewer, the more of them there are. There's a safety in numbers effect. It's been pretty well studied. So protecting vulnerable road users has both the effect of directly protecting them and also one of the main reason actually people don't get on bicycles to get places is because they feel unsafe. And so when you make them feel safe, you get more, and more provides its own additional safety effect. And then third, to reduce overall vehicle travel and sprawl design. And there's some research on this as well. If you look through this, if you want to dig into the substantial evidence, there's quite a bit presented in this document. It's a pretty well-referenced document. But these are the general approaches for safety we recommend if you are looking to actually reduce injuries and fatalities, traffic injuries and fatalities. So know that this resource is here. I will unshare my screen and we can go on. Let me see, did I fully answer that question?
I believe you did. I think that the questioner will let us know if you haven't. There's definitely room to in that queue. We only have about 3 questions in the queue. We are about 2 minutes into our second hour of this 6th installment of our office hours presentation brought to you by the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. My name is William Walker, and I'm joined by Chris Ganson, Jeannie Lee, Natalie Cuffel, and Alyssa Montanez. Please continue to ask your questions. We do not have enough questions to go another hour, so this is your warning that if we don't have enough questions to take you to 12 o'clock, we'll probably dispense with this recording very soon, or with this presentation, which is being recorded to YouTube. So you can find that YouTube channel on our OPR website, opr.ca.gov. The question that is to be read next, that I'm currently reading right now, is, are the 4 general strategies listed below the general ways that a project could help reduce their VMT impact, either through project design features or mitigations? And here are the 4 strategies by the questioner: changing land use mixes, utilizing transportation demand management measures, installing active transportation infrastructure, utilizing mitigation banks or exchanges.
So those are definitely 4 approaches. I'm not sure whether I'm going to be able to answer if those are the extent of all approaches, if there's nothing else you could do besides those. But yes, changing land use mixes, right? For example, a monoculture housing development at the urban periphery without any sort of retail, and people are going to clearly have to drive outside of that project in order to do their shopping. So you could reduce the vehicle travel by adding retail in that example. Using travel demand management measures, and that's kind of a catch-all phrase for doing things that reduce VMT. So whether it is, if you were to put in there, not just offer transit passes or enhanced transit service, or have a transportation management entity help people help find commute alternatives, but also for an office development, for example, supply less parking, or have a parking cash out program, or require or price your parking. Those could all be considered travel demand management measures. And you could kind of think of transportation or travel demand management measures as a catch-all for kind of other besides land uses and infrastructure. So yeah, installing active transportation, or I would add transit infrastructure you could also fund transit service or transit vehicles. I don't know if that was the questioner was considering that infrastructure. And then there's this option of using mitigation banks and exchanges we've touched upon, but essentially saying, okay, it would be expensive to mitigate VMT here. why don't we spend that money in a place where it would do more elsewhere, so we could do that in do our mitigation in the most efficient and effective manner.
I
Yeah,
feel like telework fits in here somewhere.
yeah, telework would be considered. Thanks for that prompt. Telework would be a great additional example of a travel demand management measure.
All
Yeah,
right.
thanks, Will.
Sure. From a practical perspective, is VMT quantified using cell phone data? And are there references to sources that discuss those techniques?
Yes, in a nutshell, VMT can be quantified using GPS data generally from people's cell phones. What there are is a few organizations. Streetlight Data is one of them, and I think there's another one called Replica, and I think there's a few others. I'm not familiar with all of them, that basically take cell phone data, and anonymize it, or it may be anonymized by the time it gets to them, I'm not sure. Then basically you can then look at the existing level of VMT to a location or to an area. So one great use for that data is to provide a map of where VMT is already low and where it might be streamlined. We are actually getting a hold, currently in the process of acquiring some GPS-based data for use on a tool that we are going live with pretty soon, that will be able to tell you, you'll be able to click on a parcel. It's called Site Check. You'll be able to click on a parcel and it will let you know what Sequa exemptions are available for that parcel, and it will share the VMT as a % of city or regional average household VMT, and office VMT as a % of regional average. And then so that sort of data again can be used to make a map showing areas that would be fully streamlined. Of course, cell phone data can't tell you what's going to happen in the future as a result of your project. So if you're using just for streamlining, then you don't need any sort of additional modeling. But you do need to then do some work to see what VMT will be in the future with your project. Cell phone data is a measurement, and of course you can't measure something that isn't there yet, so you need to model it to assess to your best, to the best you can, what VMT is likely to be generated as a result of your project.
Great. From this particular questionnaires experience, municipal traffic engineers are taking approaches to improve safety by narrowing travel lanes, increased ped and bike facilities, etc.
Yes, thanks for that comment. And that's also what I've seen. I didn't mention it, but one of the best, or one key strategy to increasing driver attention is installing narrower travel lanes on surface streets. There's a growing body of literature, academic literature on that, and that is referenced in the safety appendix, the Appendix B of the general plan guidelines that I showed you a little bit ago.
And that's also available in the chat. Thanks to Natalie for providing that
Thanks,
link.
Natalie.
Does the OPR SB 743 webpage have a very succinct history of bill implementation to date that planners can reference or use when updating project team members about the fundamentals of the law? I feel like this is like a referendum on my performance. And as a planner,
I don't think you can get a referendum yet. Well, you're only 6 weeks in.
I'm triggered. No. And as a planner, the person who's asking this question could use a similar animal explaining that LOS, delay, and congestion are not considered impact under Sequa, tiering that information to law. So I will say that we have been in the process of updating our website with these details of questions that you all have asked through this web series, through the webinars in April, through emails that we received, through questions, and we are in the process of trying to provide the succinct history, and we are working on it. So that's my brief response. I think that we talked about cities like San Jose, Oakland, and Los Angeles, who are definitely in the throes of implementing it. We've also, I was able to find that documentation from LA Metro about how that particular agency, which isn't a city, they're not a county, they're a special district, but they are working in partnership with a number of different cities and their county in implementing 743 with a number of their projects that they're building throughout. They're somewhere in tandem with their transportation services as well. So we are in the process of culling all that information, and as this questioner has also asked that we provide an update by email, we are in the process of developing that update. And as we make changes to the website, we will be committed to providing that information to you. Chris is sharing his screen right now.
I thought I would show the website again, yeah, because I wanted to point to a few resources that might be helpful here. So first, the new frequently asked questions document, again, that has basic questions answered. What is SB 743? Why was the change needed? What are the benefits of moving to VMT? You know, where does it benefit? Affected housing costs, all these kind of big picture, you know, elected official may be interested in the answer to some of these questions, people at planning director or public works director levels, and then the how down here. I would also point to, let's see, these narrated presentations here. So there's 4 of them, and again, 2 of them are fairly high level when they pop up. They're good at conveying kind of the why not LOS and why VMT. If you're looking for more how to measure, then these next 2 videos are good quick overviews. Again, about you know, 10 or 12 minutes worth of video, and that'll get you a long way towards understanding how we're suggesting you quantify vehicle travel. You know, as far as quick and easy resources, I think those are the first I would point to. Yeah, but feel free to ask a follow-up question if that doesn't answer.
And we continue to update the webpage. This is a pretty comprehensive update. The FAQ section is really useful. At least I find it useful, and we hope that you all do too. So I'm going to move on to the next question, but definitely if there is a follow-up to that, please throw that down in the Q&A box. We have 5 questions on deck. We have about 45 minutes left in the presentation. So you're very, you are encouraged by myself and my colleagues to ask your questions, please. Previously, our jurisdiction, the questioner states, would analyze housing based on dwelling units and with some customization, such as if it were senior housing. How would one analyze housing based on any known factors? For instance, the questioner has a proposal for farm worker housing in a town with no agricultural jobs, but agricultural land is located outside the city limits. How would one go about this versus unrestricted multifamily housing, which could have jobs anywhere in and out of town?
Okay. Let's see. Previous jurisdiction based housing based on dwelling units. Right. So the customization remains appropriate if a development is going to is tailored to a population that, for example, is low VMT, like seniors, or in many cases farm workers. Then that should be considered and compared against for housing projects against the city or regional housing VMT per capita, or residential VMT per capita. So let's see. For instance, we have a proposal for farm worker housing in a town with no agricultural jobs, but ag land outside the city limits. Right. So obviously, agricultural jobs are not going to be in a city. They're going to be in a they're going to be in where the food is produced. So you would just essentially assess them the same way you would any residential project. Farm workers oftentimes have to go further, but oftentimes also are pooling, so that oftentimes will lead to lower VMT overall. Where mitigation might be needed, there's a lot of existing van pool sorts of programs that could be expanded upon. Let's see, the other example is unrestricted. I'm assuming that's not necessarily not designated affordable or senior, but it's multifamily apartments. Again, you don't know where they're going to be working, but you are looking at the essentially your best understanding. And oftentimes you'll get that by looking at adjacent development. So if you're putting a new development in, oftentimes it's going to be the travel patterns from that development are going to be similar to one nearby. Now, if you're looking at multifamily and what's nearby is single family, a multifamily tends to generate fewer trips, and so you could factor that in as well. So I'll stop there. If I haven't answered that fully, please follow up.
Our next question is not necessarily an SB 743 implementation question, but it's more of like a future California question. As our policies encourage less parking spaces, more bike parking, how would one foresee those facilities getting connected in the long run so there is a real active transportation network? What are the funding mechanisms for such a network?
Right. So I won't be able to answer in great detail the state's overall funding mechanisms for active transportation, although we have fairly robust ones. I'll just add that mitigation, VMT mitigation can be active transportation facilities. So this could provide a new funding stream for active transportation, whereas the money, mitigation money may have been invested previously in laying down more pavement for turn lanes or through lanes or funding traffic signals and such. It now may be able to be used for laying down, striping a bike lane, or providing bulb out. Again, the various sorts of infrastructure that make biking and walking easier. So that's an answer. I'm not going to be able to give a comprehensive answer on funding for active transportation projects, but certainly 743 really has the opportunity to contribute there.
Right. To continue, this might be a follow-up to this questioner's previous question. LOS would then be used to identify areas where the potential for issues to occur and not necessarily used to call out increases in vehicle capacity increases. Where local agencies could use assistance is working with Caltrans on projects that are within a city but reside on a state highway. Has Caltrans staff been updated on VMT and removal of LOS from the Sequa process?
Yes, and in fact, I'm actually going to pull up Caltrans's.
I was going to say, we definitely are trying to link to their site. Our link is broken, but if we could share the Caltrans site where people could
probably have that up either later today or Friday, that Caltrans site, but you can go to it directly just by, give me a sec to share my screen again. Okay, just by typing in Caltrans SB 743 and clicking on the 743 webpage. So Caltrans is actually working on a number. You can see they're working on a few documents in response to 743. They also, I've heard a number of cities raise concerns about approaches on on state highways running through cities over the years. And I really think that we have a new Caltrans with respect to this issue and respect to other issues as well. But the new director for planning and modal programs at Caltrans, for example, is the former policy director of California Bicycle Coalition, and really understands the geometric needs in cities for roads passing through, and how that's important to foster economic growth in the cities, rather than just have the objective of vehicle travel passing through the city quickly. So I'll say that very generally. The new director of Caltrans also has a strong background in active transportation. Is a key member of the AASHTO Committee on Active Transportation. So Caltrans is also in the process of developing 3 documents. One is close to release. One is the Transportation Impact Study Guide, which is how they review land use projects, and that has been updated to align with SB 743. And the other 2 are how Caltrans assesses its own projects. One, how it measures induced vehicle travel for roadway capacity projects, and another on just how to integrate that analysis into a Sequa analysis. So those documents were out for public review. Caltrans now has them in-house and is making updates in response to public review. And in the coming weeks or month or so, plans to re-release those documents. So I'd take a look there, and you can look at other materials on Caltrans's website as well.
AASHTO, Association of American State Highway Transportation Officials. For folks who don't know what AASHTO is, I know that we're an in crowd, we're planners, we should all know it, but just for folks who don't. Provision of transit passes to employees or residents is commonly raised as a potential VMT mitigation strategy. Wouldn't such a mitigation need to be provided in perpetuity to be a justifiable VMT mitigation measure?
I would, I'll ask if Jeannie or Natalie has anything to add to this. Feel free to jump in. The mitigation would need to be provided, obviously, not just for year 1, but I would point to that there are those who have come up with cost figures for VMT mitigation that are as if you were purchasing transit passes at the full and normal price for every resident for decades into the future. You're never going to actually do that, because nearly always a transit agency will provide the opportunity to buy bulk passes at a deep discount, because the transit agent is going to realize that when a person goes to buy a transit pass themselves, they're obviously going to use it a good amount. They're going to make sure that they get their money's worth. When you provide transit passes to a population of people, the people in a whole new development, some of them are going to elect to take transit because you provided that. So you will increase the transit ridership, and others will not. And most transit agencies will recognize that providing those passes is not going to load their vehicles up nearly as much as an individual buying a transit pass. So they'll oftentimes provide those passes in bulk at pennies on the dollar. Of course, transit is not everywhere, and it isn't, so it can't be a mitigation measure for everywhere. Yeah, it would not just be for initial year. I don't have the legal background to know how long that mitigation would need to extend. So if Jeannie or Natalie don't have anything to chime in with, we can just go ahead to the next question.
Yeah, Chris, I don't have anything to add. I think it would depend on how the mitigation was structured and whether you were trying to front load VNT reduction or spread it out over a number of years.
Yeah, thanks.
2 questions left. If we are done with these 2 questions, we will be left with ending our office hours presentation number 6 early. So just last call for questions in the Q&A feature. That last call was very useful. Already got our next question. 3 questions now in the queue. The next question is adding low cost housing to a project of VMT mitigation.
So it depends on context. It could be low cost housing to a project. So if a project would reduce its VMT by adding low cost housing, then yeah, it could be a mitigation. Also, affordable housing that's designated affordable, we recommend streamlining. So that's an additional factor. Dale, let me know if I've gotten at your question, or if I haven't gotten at your question, just follow up. Thanks.
Back to the number of 2 questions remaining. 2 questions remaining, folks. Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. As jurisdictions update and adopt guidelines to comply with Senate Bill 743, is there oversight to ensure they are meeting the intent and goals set forth in the bill and OPR's technical advisory?
So this is a general Sequa question, really. Oversight in Sequa is provided by people who are monitoring projects and looking at the environmental documents to see if they are sufficiently rigorous. Answering the question strictly, is there a state agency that is overseeing documents to make sure they are rigorous? The answer is no. Generally speaking, will we be looking at implementation and looking at Sequa documents and using that to provide additional guidance? Certainly. So we will be monitoring, and in the big picture, looking at how cities, counties, lead agencies are operationalizing VMT, and then as we feel appropriate and needed and helpful, providing additional guidance.
Great. OPR's technical advisory identifies a screening threshold for small projects that generate 110 or fewer daily trips. Some local agencies are in the process of adopting VMT guidelines that include small project screening thresholds for larger developments with higher daily trip allowances, citing back to development consistent with and generating greenhouse gas emissions lower than greenhouse gas screening thresholds for a given reason. What was OPR's evaluation process for the small project screening, and were larger project sizes considered?
Yeah, so take that that second to last question. What was OPR's process for the small project screening threshold? You can see the methodology in the technical advisory. It's actually a footnote. I won't go through the whole thing here, but essentially references another Sequa. I think I'm right to call it an exemption. But anyway, verify that that's the right word. Take a look at that. That reference, or that footnote in the technical advisory. Now, could a city, so a lead agency, taking a step back again in Sequa, a lead agency can determine its approach and could provide its own substantial evidence justifying a larger number of trips being below a small project threshold. So let's say I'm taking a look at the question to see if I'm missing anything. Larger development. So, okay, question about connecting back to development consistent with and generating GHG emissions lower than the GHG screening threshold for a given region. Keep in mind that VMT, although we're recommending using GHG looking at GHG reduction needs at the state and crosswalking that for your thresholds, because GHG is such a clear environmental impact and we have such clear environmental goals enshrined in law, that VMT is also about an array of other impacts to human health and the environment. You know, everything from air quality, other air quality, traffic safety, land consumption, impervious surface, etc. You can review the whole array of them in previous materials and previous in the webinar that we gave on our which is on our website. But can connecting to a city, I'm imagining a general plan or some sort of city policy overall, that in a sort of tiering fashion could work, but you'd need to make sure that what you're tiering from is actually achieving those statewide emissions targets. So it would be important to look at that as a starting point. I think I'll leave that one there.
Great.
Please do follow up again if I missed or if you want to if I missed a detail of what you're getting at.
I generally take our questions in order, but I'm learning that if your clock is different on your computer, your questions come in a different order. So I'm going to jump to a question that's third from the bottom. Any thoughts on how VMT could be applied to a housing project that has no parking and tenants are not allowed to have vehicles and in turn are given vouchers for transportation service providers like Uber, Lyft, and private buses? Specifically, this is a housing project for a research campus, and the housing is not on the campus. The concern is not necessarily to and from the campus, it's travel elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. So first, I would imagine not supplying parking and offering, let's see, vouchers for transportation services like Uber and Lyft, and private buses. Could reduce VMT, but I think you need to show a little bit of work if that was what you thought was going to happen. In part because we do have studies showing Lyft and Uber, for every mile that they take a passenger, there's a substantially more amount of vehicle travel. I think about, I don't remember the number, but I could be wrong about this, but another 40% the vehicle travel from deadheading from the Lyft or Uber driver traveling to the pickup. So you'd want to factor that in. But oftentimes, if you substitute, depending on how the vouchers are, if people had to pay for their Lyft and Uber, then that's going to factor in each time they make their mode choice, right? Do I get on my bike? Do I walk? Or do I take a Lyft or an Uber? Well, it's costing me this much to take Lyft and Uber. So that sort of price signal can really reduce the amount of vehicle travel. Of course, private buses can be a very efficient way of moving numbers of people. Yeah, I think that answers that question. Again, follow up if there's if I didn't get what you were hoping.
All right. The questioner says that in the past, one of our webinars stated that having affordable housing in a project exempts it from Senate Bill 743. How does adding...
go ahead.
I mean, is that true? And then the question is, how does adding affordable housing make it acceptable from Sequa de facto, and how much must be added to exempt the project?
Right. Okay. So it's not exempt from Sequa de facto, and it's not exempted from 743. Affordable housing, a project that's fully affordable housing, the housing is all affordable. We recommend presuming it less than significant. That's unlikely to have a significant, unless you have evidence to the contrary, that just assume that that's going to have a less than significant impact. And we provide some substantial evidence for that in the technical advisory. Let's see. Oh, I lost that. Oh, okay. I think I pretty much
I
answered
think you
it.
hit it. That's why I
Okay,
dismissed
thanks.
it. Please let us know if we did not hit that question. Next question is, I do many projects, the person asking the question, with just heavy trucks. What is the VMT evaluation? Just employees at those locations that are commuting to work. And the questioner also states, heavy duty trucks generally aren't considered in VMT evaluations. Why are they not evaluated?
So we looked really carefully at how 743 would apply to trucking, to freight. We looked at it in a number of contexts. We talked to ports. We talked to the folks at doing warehousing projects and others and technical experts. We realized that in few, if any cases, would studying the VMT of trucks ultimately be helpful. The law provided us the opportunity to define what our metric was, including what our metric and including what our metric applied to. The Sequa guidelines spell out that we're looking at auto travel, and the technical advisory specifies that that means light duty vehicle travel, like autos and light, so-called light trucks, which are SUVs and pickup trucks and things that people use as automobiles in this day and age.
All right.
Oh, there was a bit of a question. Let me add a little more on what you would consider from a freight project. And yes, the questioner suggested commute travel should be considered, and yes, we concur with that.
Great. If there is time, can I ask a non-VMT question? I'm going to say yes to that, so that person should just ask your question. That was quick. Local agencies have seen changes in Caltrans review of projects during the entitlement and environmental review process. Where we have issues is obtaining an encroachment permit to build what has already been approved. We are often required to perform additional studies by Caltrans staff to justify the improvements.
Yeah, so I would again point to Caltrans's current work. Caltrans is in big transition on this. So in the past, and maybe even into the present, in the past they've certainly required LOS analyses. Their local development intergovernmental review program has requested LOS analyses, and they're ceasing to do that. Sometimes they've required safety analyses and operations analyses that look a lot like LOS analyses, and they're in the process of examining their practices there. And also they're pivoting to request VMT analyses in line with our recommendations for studying VMT. So take a look, I would suggest, at the guidance documents that Caltrans is releasing, and expect some transition in that area.
All right. Could VMT generated by electric vehicles be considered a reduction or mitigation in VMT?
Short answer is no, because they're still generating VMT. They may be, they're probably generating reduced greenhouse gases and air pollutants. A smaller amount is coming out at the power plant than compared to a internal combustion engine vehicle coming out of the tailpipe. So it's more out of the way for climate change. That doesn't matter, but it's also a lower amount. So that's an improvement for those factors. But electric vehicle VMT is just as environmentally impactful in many other impact categories. For example, the impervious surface required to carry them, the safety impacts, the substitution away from active transportation impacting people's health, et cetera. So you can't use electric vehicle vehicle electrification as a mitigation for VMT. Now it will show up as a mitigation for greenhouse gases and air quality in your Sequa document.
Great. Again, 2 questions left. We have about 20 minutes left. So I'm sure if you ask enough questions, we can take it up to noon. But if there are no further questions after these two questions, we will probably end our series here. Next question. The footnote regarding small projects is 110 vehicle trips. Our analysis of Cal eMod shows that evaluation is actually targeting 110 one-way trips and 55 round trips. Do you agree with this evaluation? The footnote is not clear.
I think I'd have to go back and look at that in more detail. Generally, though, yeah, generally a trip is a one-way trip. So it's not different from a tour. So it's a vehicle leaving the premises, and a vehicle arriving will be another trip because presumably they've gone somewhere. So they've taken a trip there and a trip back. So if that, I hope that answers the question.
Question, and this is a little bit this is the non-VMT question. The local newspaper for this questioner just went to online only, meaning they are no longer printing actual newspapers due to impacts from COVID-19. Has any other jurisdiction or folks working in jurisdictions experienced this, and how would one handle posting a legal notice during COVID-19? Electronic is okay, but what about after?
Yeah, I'm sorry that I don't have the background to be able to provide any advice, and I know we generally don't provide legal advice. We're not able to provide legal advice generally at OPR. So I don't know, I don't have enough depth on the noticing requirements to be able to help you on that. Apologies.
We are at the point of no open questions. Chris?
Okay. Well, you know, William introduced this as the final office hour. We'll see. It could be that we're gonna be watching closely and seeing how questions come in, and if there are a lot of them, we may continue this office hour, continue to hold office hours in past July 1. But do feel free to send your questions to our question email. And we will try and be as useful as we can in answering them. We're really dedicated to implementing SB 743 in a way that elevates jurisdictions across the state, achieves our collective goals, and is protective of the environment, but also streamlining of the economy and of people's ability to get places. And we do believe and see that it's going to help with all those goals. Thanks for all of your engagement and effort in implementing. Again, we're here to help you on to the future. Use us. So let's go ahead and wrap up there. Any last words, William, or should we log off?
Last words.
Thank
That's
you.
a wonderful.
Yeah, I shouldn't call it last words. Any final
remarks? I just will encourage folks to use our email address. Pardon the fact that I didn't edit a slide for today. SB743questions@opr.ca.gov. We are open to having more office hours presentations if these are useful for you all. So continue to send us your questions. Continue to use our website, opr.ca.gov, where you will find our transportation impacts portion of that website. And it'll have all the information that you need to implement SB 743 in your jurisdiction. And any words from our chief counsel, land use counsel, Jeannie or Natalie?
Yeah, we'll put them on the spot to finish up.
Thank you. No comments for me. Thanks everyone for joining us today.
Great.
Thanks for your help, Natalie, Jeannie, and Alyssa, who is behind the scenes, but making this all work.
All right, arriving to you.
I wanted to say thanks.
No, say that again, Jeannie. Sorry.
Oh, I just wanted to also thank everyone for joining us through our 6 series, webinar series. And like William said, please continue to contact us. We are ready, willing, and able to answer your questions.
I think we've had about everything that could happen in the series happen, even an earthquake. So I just want to send out thoughts to the world. Hopefully everyone's safe, socially distanced, and continue to persevere. And we're here to help with any of these implementation questions. Coming to you socially distanced from Sacramento and San Francisco. This has been Alyssa, Natalie, Janie, Chris, and myself, William, and another production of Office Hours from the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. Thank you very much for joining us.